Hi everyone, uh, this is Muhammad Amir Khan again with one more video. So today's topic is constraints. Okay, so in couple of my videos, what I have discussed is more like SQL scripting. Okay, so basically in SAP HANA, whatever you create graphically, in the backend SQL script gets generated. Okay, and if you know or if you are thorough in SQL scripting, then you can easily work on SAP HANA, especially while creating procedures, functions, or store procedures, table functions, and scripted calculation views. So all these needs scripting. So if you are good in scripting, then definitely you can uh, develop complex models. Okay, so today is also one of the topics which is used or which can be used while creating procedures, scripted calculation views, and also table functions. Okay, so constraints, what it is. So whenever you are defining some columns, whenever you are declaring some columns, or whenever you are creating some columns, you can restrict the data, what type of data that column should hold. You can restrict, or you can set some rules to that particular column, what kind of data should be entered or what kind of data should not be entered. Okay, this is what it is for. Constraints define specific rules to the columns data in the database table. Okay, in any table, if you are defining some column, you can put some rule or condition, what kind of data should be there in that particular column or field. Okay, basically while inserting, updating, or deleting the data rows, if the rules of the constraints are not followed, the system will display an error message and the action will be terminated. We set some rule to the column. Okay, so if that rule is not followed upon inserting or updating or deleting the rows, then what happens is the system throws an error and the action gets terminated. Okay, SQL constraints are defined while creating a new table. While creating a new table, at the time of defining the field names or columns, we define the constraint as well. We can also alter the table and add a new SQL constraint. So once the constraint is created, or once the we want to change the constraint, then we can do it also by altering the table. So this is we can discuss this in detail in coming slides. Okay, constraints are mainly used to maintain data integrity. Okay, so we can ensure that the data in that column is good. Okay, the data integrity is maintained. Okay, because the data entered should be following in the set of rules what we define to that column. Okay, so we'll discuss this point again. Why do we need constraints? Constraints are basically used to restrict the insertion of unwanted data in the database. That means they are mainly used to maintain data integrity. We can create the constraint on single or multiple columns of the table. What are the different types of constraints? There are like some 6 types of constraints which can be used to maintain the data integrity. Not null constraint is one of the types. Unique key constraint, default constraint, check key constraint. So these are the like list of constraints what we can use it to maintain the data integrity. Apart from that, we have referential foreign key constraint, primary key constraint. Yeah, we can discuss that in detail. Before understanding the constraint, first we need to understand the null. So we have something called as null. So null represents the absence of data or value in the column of the table. It is neither zero nor empty. In order to understand this, let's create. So we created one student database table, and student So next paragraph, student id is an integer data type and it is not null. So that is what you can see in the bottom of the screen. Student id int is a data type, student id is a field name, not null is a constraint. Okay, when we say not null, so it will not allow null entries in it. It should be not null always. So what is null? It is neither zero nor empty. So it is null, null word. It is not, it does not allow the word null. Okay, so it does not mean that it's empty or it's zero. So student id is an int data type and it is not null. On the other hand, full name and registered number fields are null. Okay, you can see on the bottom of the screen, full name and registered number are having the constraints null. By this you may have understand the syntax of how to use these constraints or how to use a constraint. So null, we know that it is not a zero or it's not a empty value. It is some null record. Null is a value, so which is expecting some record to be inserted. Empty is a value. Empty, which means we don't have anything in it. That is also a value. Zero is also a value, but null is not a value. It, yeah. So we created a student table. So it has three entries: student id, full name and register number, and it has some data type int varchar 50 and also int. So we have some constraints also beside that. So not null is a constraint, null is a constraint. Okay, so okay, that's fine. So null is not a constraint. Basically we need to understand, like, okay, this is also, this could also be treated as a constraint. Okay, so inserting some records in it, right? First, so how to use, like how to use or how to define the constraint, that we are going to discuss now. We can impose the constraints on the tables columns in two ways. Okay, imposing constraint on table on column level, or imposing constraints on table level. In the first case, we need to provide the constraint information next to the column name. How we have seen here, next to the column name you can see the constraint not null. So this is at the column level. Okay, and one is imposing the constraint on table level. In the first case, we need to provide the constraint information next to the column name, whereas in the second case, we first define all the columns and then we need to define the constraint for that columns. Okay, we cannot impose a not null constraint on the table level. Fine, it is possible only for the rest of the four constraints. Okay, let's understand this with an example. So as you can see, in the following create table statement, we have specified primary key, not null and unique constraints directly at the column level. So you can see uh, beside the call id we have the data type, and next to the data type we have a constraint name like primary key. So it is at the column level. So for every column or next to the column name we have the constraint name as well. So this is a column level constraint. Imposing MySQL constraint at table level. So here you can see first all the data types or all the fields has been defined. Once all the fields have been defined, in the bottom you can see unique as a constraint name, and that constraint is applied to the email id field. So this is how we can impose the constraint at the table level. These are the two types of two ways to impose the constraint. Okay, we can impose the multiple constraints also. So we can create a constraint with user defined name also. You can see in this you can see like constraint, writing the constraint keyword and writing the constraint name id underscore unique, and then we are writing the what type of behavior it should have, like unique constraint or what. So then we can use the user defined constraint name, right? A user defined constraint name to use the functionality of like unique constraint in our case. Okay, so this is what it is. So what are like composite constraints? We have composite constraints as well. like it is possible to create a constraint based on multiple columns, and we can do so. It is called as uh, composite constraints. So in the below example you can see name and email. The combination of these two fields should satisfy like unique. Unique is something like uh, the name and employee should be unique in every record, so that is what it is. So combination of more than one field is also should be like checked. Combination of more than one field, like two fields should be checked in terms of like if they are unique or not. So this is also possible. Okay, so next what we'll discuss is we'll directly go to like directly go to the one of the types of constraint, that is not null constraint. By default the database column stores null value, means no value in the data row. By defining not null, by default the database column stores null value means no value in the data row. Okay, by default what happens is it stores null values, okay, in the column. By defining not null constraint to the table column, the default behavior of the database column changes, and it does not allow it does not accept the null value. So if you are imposing not null constraint to any of the fields, you you need to enter some value, like it cannot be null. So by default it is null, right? So it cannot be null. Whenever it sees the null, it throws an error. Okay, in the database we can we can have some columns where storing null value does not make any sense, right? So in for these columns we can impose the constraint not null. So if you want any column not to accept null values, then you need to apply the not null constraint. Okay, so this is what it is. A table can contain any number of not null constraints. Okay, it's not like only for one field or two field we can apply, and it cannot be applied for multiple fields. It's not like that. So we can apply not null constraint to more than one fields or any number of fields or any number of columns while creating a table also. Okay, and it can be defined to string as well as numeric data types such as int, varchar, etc. Okay, so I have given an example to demonstrate the not null constraint. Okay, created some student table. It has student id, full name, registered number, branch, and mobile. So it has some data types, and next to the data types I have written not null as a constraint. So that will not allow me to leave the fields empty, which means if I leave it without writing anything to this column, then by default system will take the null. So that should not be happening here, because I'm using the not null. If I'm leaving it, then it holds null value, but this constraint does not allow the null value, and it will throw an error. Okay, that is how it is. Okay, so yeah, for any existing table. So if you want to check the constraints, you can use the below SQL query. Okay, let's say you have some table, and if you want to check if okay if what columns have what constraints, or how the table is defined, what constraints have been used, you can use the describe keyword, describe space table name. So by this syntax, or by this statement, you can know the table with what constraints it holds. Okay, so altering table also is possible. We need to write alter table name, modify the column name. Okay, and you can use your constraint like null and all. Okay, so by describing it you can see if it is modified or not. So insertion of table, insert into the table student. So this is what you can insert, like with null entry also. Okay, first we need to delete the data row which contains null values in the first name. So first we need to delete the data before like changing its constraint. Okay, so null is allowed here now. Fine. So I think by now you have understand the term constraint. So it ensures that the data integrity is maintained and we have a quality data. So if, let's say, if I am creating a table with student table with student id as blank or student id as repeating, so it does not make sense. The data integrity is not there, right? So when I want to maintain the data integrity, then one of these constraints or these constraints can be used. We have a constraint called unique, right? So that can be imposed. So if I impose that constraint in student id, then I can never leave, I cannot have the duplicate or same ids, okay, to different students. So if I have it by mistake, then it will throw me an error stating that the constraint does not have the constraint is does not matches or not following the constraint rules. Okay, so I have discussed one constraint that is not null. So we have like 5 more constraints that can be discussed in further videos. Okay, so this can be used while creating a database table, and it imposes some rule while inserting or deleting or updating some data. It checks some rules. Okay, if let's say student id, if I want all the unique entries, so when I use unique or primary key, for example, this constraint, then that constraint will ensure me that I have unique or primary key or unique entries in that particular column. Whenever I see duplicate entries, then it will throw me an error. So it ensures the data integrity. So I have just gone through the definition and the overview of constraint, but the types of constraint we can discuss it in next videos, which makes very sense of using constraints while creating the database table. Okay, I hope this video is useful. uh, so thanks for watching my video. Have a nice day. Bye bye.